A woman is dragged before the judges, accused of sorcery so grotesque it sounds like dark satire. She is charged with stealing men's genitals and keeping them as if they were tiny pets in a nest, feeding them oats and kernels of corn. Meanwhile, in another part of town, a pig is placed on trial, formally prosecuted for having intimate relations with its human owner. If convicted, both man and animal will be burned alive before a crowd. And at the city brothel, women forced into prostitution prepare for the emperor's arrival. They are dressed in yellow hoods fitted with jingling bells, a law-mandated uniform, ready to chain the emperor with golden links as part of his official ceremonial welcome. This was medieval sexuality, a realm so bizarre and unsettling that historians for centuries avoided speaking about it at all, burying records in silence as if pretending it had never existed. Forget the romanticized vision of chivalrous knights and obedient peasants. The truth is darker. This was a society where wives were ordered by courts to stimulate their husbands before a jury of judges to prove whether impotence was real or fabricated. Where physicians prescribed female orgasms as legitimate treatment for a wandering womb. Where the act of becoming pregnant from an assault was considered legal evidence of consent. These were not fables or exaggerated myths. They were real customs, laws, and punishments, meticulously documented in trial records, medical manuscripts, and canonical codes. What you're about to explore is a disturbing catalogue of the strangest, most shocking practices that medieval Europeans not only engaged in, but also institutionalized through law and medicine. And at the very heart of it all stood one institution, the Catholic Church, whose influence reached directly into the most private corners of people's lives. Imagine yourself in 13th century France. You're married, blessed by the Church, and yet desire for your spouse is something you must time with precision. Because the Church had drafted a sexual calendar so impossibly restrictive that some historians later drew entire flowcharts to map it. No sex on Sundays, God's day of rest. No sex on Fridays, the day Christ died. No sex on Thursdays, reserved to honor the Last Supper. During Lent, 40 days of total abstinence. During Advent, for weeks more. And scattered throughout the year, countless feast and saint days forbade intimacy. It did not end there. If your wife was menstruating, untouchable, unclean. If she had recently given birth, 40 days minimum before resuming relations, and if she was breastfeeding, many priests forbade intimacy altogether, claiming intercourse corrupted the milk and endangered the child. One German penitential ordered 3 years of fasting on bread and water if a couple dared be intimate during nursing. By some calculations, a law-abiding Christian couple could manage intercourse less than once a week in an entire year. And even when the calendar allowed it, the act itself was bound by strict rules. Only one position was sanctioned, missionary. Anything else was sodomy. Woman on top? 40 days of penance. Dog-like posture? 3 years. Any act that blocked conception? 7 years of penance. The Canons of Theodore, a 7th century manual still circulating in the medieval world, even declared that oral emission was the gravest sin imaginable, worse than murder, worse than heresy. Even enthusiasm was condemned. Too much passion, sin. Too loud, sin. Taking too long, sin. One French bishop ruled that couples who lingered in embraces or expressed excessive affection must undergo penance. The ideal Christian encounter, according to clerical texts, should be brief, silent, purposeful, and without any trace of pleasure, performed solely out of duty, never desire. Yet the irony was grotesque. The same priests who preached chastity were found so often in brothels that the Church itself began to tax prostitution directly. This tax was called the collegium, essentially a fornication fee. Pay it, and a clergyman could keep his mistress without fear of punishment. Surviving account books from England and Germany list these payments casually, right alongside burial fees and tithes. In Norwich, 1450, church ledgers note the collegium income between baptisms and funerals. In some German regions, nearly 1/3 of parish priests were paying the tax. The hypocrisy deepened inside monasteries. Far from being havens of purity, they were often hotbeds of scandal. When clergy were caught in grave transgressions, punishments were brutal. Take the infamous case of the Nun of Wotton, recorded in 12th century England. A young girl forced into convent life as a child became pregnant by a lay brother. When discovered, the other nuns seized her lover, dragged him before her, and forced her to castrate him with her own hands. According to the chronicler, one elder nun then grabbed the severed organs, dripping with blood, and shoved them into the pregnant girl's mouth. What followed was interpreted as divine. Her pregnancy vanished, and she was accepted back into the convent as if absolved. To them, this act of mutilation and humiliation was not a crime but an act of spiritual cleansing. If religion imposed impossible restrictions, medicine made everything worse with catastrophic theories about reproduction. Physicians clung to ancient Greek ideas. Women needed to orgasm to conceive. This belief became known as the two-seed theory. Both man and woman, they claimed, had to emit seed for conception. Without mutual climax, no child could be created. Influential writers like William of Conches, tutor to Henry II of England, wrote extensively in the 1150s insisting that pregnancy was impossible without pleasure on both sides. This had horrific legal consequences. If pregnancy required consent, then a pregnant rape victim was by definition lying. A 13th century English legal code bluntly stated, "If she conceives from the rape, the charge must be dropped, for without consent, she could not conceive." The implications are chilling. Across Europe, from France to the Holy Roman Empire, court records show charges dismissed simply because the victim conceived. Take Lady Isabel Butler of Ireland, 15th century, abducted, repeatedly assaulted, and forced into marriage with her attacker. When she became pregnant, the courts ruled it could not have been rape. She remained his wife legally. The same physicians who dismissed women's suffering were also prescribing sexual release as treatment. They warned that women deprived of sex risked womb suffocation, a condition where the uterus supposedly wandered through the body, causing fainting, seizures, and hysteria. The cure? For married women, regular intercourse. For widows and unmarried women, manual stimulation by midwives until climax. In effect, medieval medicine institutionalized therapeutic orgasms. This bizarre practice endured for centuries, eventually paving the way for the invention of the vibrator in the 1800s. Its roots, however, lay in medieval theories of the wandering womb. When a wife accused her husband of impotence, or a man denied the paternity of his wife's children, courts had only one way to decide: public trials of virility. Imagine being dragged before judges and clerics, expected to prove your sexual function in front of witnesses. Some courts demanded that a man attempt to consummate his marriage in the presence of physicians, priests, and sometimes even neighbors. Others stripped the husband and inspected him manually for signs of arousal, while the wife was instructed to handle him in front of the panel. Failure to perform meant humiliation and annulment. Success could save a marriage, but also condemned a man to a life bound to a woman he might have wanted to leave. French records from the 15th century describe such trials in vivid detail. A husband accused of impotence was ordered to undress in the courtroom and demonstrate his virility on the spot. His wife was told to lie beside him while examiners watched. Chroniclers note that the ordeal often dragged on for hours, with witnesses describing every detail in official transcripts. Some men collapsed under the pressure. Others managed to succeed, proving potency but losing dignity forever. These cases were not rare curiosities. They were standard legal practice in cities from Paris to Bologna. Beyond impotence trials, medieval courts routinely turned sexual disputes into theater for the public. In some German towns, a convicted adulteress was paraded through the streets riding backward on a donkey, clutching the severed head of a fish, a symbol of lust and filth. Husbands accused of infidelity might be forced to wear mock antlers in public, branded cuckolds for life. The punishments combined humiliation with symbolism. Adultery was not just a private betrayal, it was a threat to the moral order of the entire community. And so, the punishment had to be visible, unforgettable, and deeply shaming. Yet perhaps nothing reveals the strangeness of medieval sexuality more than the fact that animals were tried in court for sexual crimes. If a pig, goat, or donkey was discovered in a sexual act with a human, both parties faced the same charges. Trials were formal, with lawyers appointed to defend the animals, witnesses called, and verdicts delivered with full ceremony. In 1457, a sow in Savigny was convicted of coupling with a man. Both were hanged before the townspeople. Chroniclers mention that the pig was dressed in human clothing before execution, to symbolize its complicity. These trials were not mere jokes. They reflected a worldview in which animals were seen as moral actors, capable of sin and deserving of punishment. By prosecuting them, the church and courts reinforced the belief that sexual order was divine, and any violation, whether by man or beast, required violent correction. Despite its obsession with control, medieval society simultaneously institutionalized prostitution. Across Europe, cities established government-run brothels, seeing them as a necessary outlet for male desire. Authorities argued that without prostitution, greater evils would follow: rape, adultery, sodomy. St. Augustine himself had once claimed that brothels were like sewer systems, disgusting, but essential to protect society. Thus, municipal brothels were built beside marketplaces, near city gates, or even adjacent to churches. In Paris, the municipal brothel sat just steps from Notre Dame. Prostitutes were forced to wear distinctive clothing. In parts of Germany, it was yellow hoods with bells. In Florence, striped cloaks. In England, striped hoods marked them as women of the trade. The hypocrisy is staggering. While priests denounced lust from the pulpit, many clerics were regular customers of the very women they condemned. Records from Avignon reveal priests forming long-term relationships with prostitutes, often keeping them in clerical housing. And during festivals, prostitution was not hidden but celebrated. When Emperor Charles IV visited Nuremberg in the 1300s, municipal prostitutes greeted him wearing golden chains and bells, showering him with flowers as part of the official procession. But by the end of the 15th century, this carefully balanced system of indulgence and punishment collapsed. In 1494, a new disease swept across Europe: syphilis. It spread first through the French army during the siege of Naples, then erupted across the continent with horrifying speed. Symptoms were grotesque: ulcerating sores, flesh rotting from the bone, and madness in the final stages. Chroniclers described it as a punishment from God, worse than leprosy, striking sinners and soldiers alike. Some called it the Neapolitan disease, others the French disease, but it soon became universal, the Great Pox. Brothels emptied as fear consumed cities. Physicians scrambled for cures: boiling mercury, herbal fumigations, painful ointments. Nothing worked. For the first time, medieval Europeans confronted the limits of their laws and theories. The church could not forbid the disease. The courts could not shame it away. The physicians could not explain it. Sexuality, once so rigidly controlled, now carried a terror that no calendar, no penitential, no courtroom could manage. Taken together, the sexual culture of medieval Europe appears less like a coherent system and more like a web of contradictions. A church that preached celibacy yet taxed fornication. Courts that punished passion with shame yet demanded public displays of arousal. Physicians who dismissed rape victims while prescribing orgasms as medical treatment. Communities that dressed prostitutes in bells while burning animals for sin. It was a society where sexuality was everywhere, regulated, punished, institutionalized, celebrated, yet never acknowledged honestly. For modern readers, it is tempting to laugh at the absurdities: pigs in court, calendars forbidding intimacy half the year, physicians panicking over wandering wombs. But behind the absurdity lay real suffering. Women silenced in rape trials. Men humiliated in impotence courts. Entire communities terrorized by disease. Perhaps it is no wonder that historians avoided this subject for centuries. The very sources, court records, penitentials, medical treatises, were too grotesque, too shameful, too alien to fit into polite narratives of medieval piety and progress. Only in recent decades have scholars begun piecing together the full scope of medieval sexual culture. And what they reveal is not the fantasy of noble knights and courtly love, but a world where law, medicine, and religion conspired to regulate the most intimate aspects of human life in ways that today feel almost unimaginable. By the end of the 15th century, the arrival of syphilis shattered the fragile system of sexual control in medieval Europe. What had once been regulated through calendars, penitentials, and humiliating trials could no longer contain the fear of disease. Yet the legacy of this age did not disappear. It reshaped centuries of European thought. Syphilis itself became a sermon. Priests declared it divine punishment for lust, parading relics through towns and enforcing harsher prohibitions. Brothels, once licensed and taxed, were abruptly closed. Prostitutes were expelled, yet the trade continued in secret, more dangerous than before. Sex became both hidden and more heavily policed. Medicine began to move away from old myths, realizing conception did not require female climax, but courts clung to outdated logic, dismissing rape charges if pregnancy occurred. Treatments for syphilis ranged from mercury ointments to steam baths, painful, often fatal, and rarely effective. Instead of cures, medicine deepened fears that sexuality itself was corrupting. Contradictions spread everywhere. Law treated victims with suspicion, religion preached celibacy while clergy sinned openly, medicine labeled women hysterical or diseased. Even after brothels shut down, prostitution thrived without protections, and systems meant to regulate sexuality only multiplied suffering and shame. It is tempting to dismiss these medieval practices as absurd relics: pigs in court, calendars banning intimacy, doctors fearing wandering wombs. Yet their echoes are disturbingly close. Teachings on pleasure and duty carried into later centuries, legal skepticism toward women endured, clothing and mobility were restricted, and female desire was medicalized under new labels. The Middle Ages may have ended, but their contradictions survive in altered forms. For centuries historians avoided these topics, ashamed of how grotesque they made medieval Europe appear. Only recently has research revealed that sexuality in the Middle Ages was not hidden but obsessively controlled, by church, medicine, and law alike. It was never an age of innocence, but of contradictions: sex as sin and cure, crime and duty, punishment and profit. Women silenced in trials, men shamed in courts, communities terrified of disease, all reveal a system built on fear. And though centuries have passed, the question remains: how much of that strange world have we truly left behind, and how much of it still shapes our lives today?